We must tell you plainly. At 44 years old, Odessa Marsh had nothing left in the world but a tin box of coins and the clothes on her back. She had been cast out of the only home she had ever known by her late husband's brother, Silas Marsh, who declared before the whole county that a widow with no children and no deed in her own name had no claim to the ranch her husband had built with his hands. All she carried from 22 years of marriage was $41 in silver, a quilt her mother had stitched, and a grief so quiet it had learned to walk beside her without a sound. With that small sum, she did something the town of Coldwater Bend, Wyoming Territory, would call foolish for years afterward. She paid $14 at a tax auction for a worthless strip of land known as Cliff's End, where the old Prescott Trail broke off into nothing but air and stone. Everyone said she had bought a grave for her money. But sealed inside that rock, waiting through decades of wind and silence, was a door that would change not only her fortune, but the fate of an entire forgotten town. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Odessa Marsh. If you are watching this from a town that history seems to have passed by, or from a place that feels forgotten even by its own people, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Odessa had been born Odessa Kepler, the second daughter of a wheelwright in Ohio, in a household where nothing was ever thrown away until its very last use had been wrung from it. Her father, Henry Kepler, had fled a failed harvest in the old country and arrived in America believing that the truest sin a person could commit was waste. Waste of wood, waste of cloth, waste of time, and above all, waste of a person's worth. He taught his daughters to look twice at anything the world called ruined before believing it. A cracked wool rim could still be ironed for a hinge. A torn coat could still be thread for a quilt. A broken-down horse, given rest and oats and patience, could still pull a wagon home. Odessa carried this lesson the way other children carried scripture, and it shaped the whole of her character long before she understood why it mattered. She was a quiet girl, watchful rather than talkative, the kind who noticed the things other people overlooked entirely. And this quality made her, without her ever seeking it, the one who found lost buttons, lost letters, lost meaning in objects everyone else had already dismissed. At 19, she married Thomas Marsh, a lean, sunburned young man who had come west with his brother Silas to homestead along the Sweetwater country. And for a time it seemed as though her father's philosophy and her husband's ambition were made for each other. Thomas, too, believed in second chances for broken things. He had bought their first plow horse half-lame and nursed her back to strength, had rebuilt their first cabin from a burned-out claim another family had abandoned in despair. Odessa loved him for this shared conviction as much as she loved him for anything, and in the 22 years that followed, she became the quiet architect of their small prosperity. She was the one who mended the fences no one thought worth mending, who nursed the calves everyone else had given up on, who kept the household ledgers with a precision that impressed the banker in town more than her husband's handshake ever did. She never had children, a sorrow she carried privately and without complaint, but she had, in its place, an unusual and steady friendship with the land itself, and with the handful of neighbors who had learned, over the years, that Odessa Marsh could be trusted with anything broken, whether it was a fence post or a person's pride. Thomas died in the spring of 1885, thrown from a horse during a cattle drive along the river bottoms, and it was in the raw weeks after his burial that Odessa first understood how little the world valued a woman's labor once the man whose name covered it was gone. She had helped build every fence post and balance every account on that ranch. Yet the deed, as it turned out, had been recorded solely in Thomas's name, with Silas listed as co-signer on the original claim from years before when the brothers had first filed together. Silas Marsh had never done an honest day's work on that land in a decade. He had drifted through mining camps and card tables while Thomas and Odessa built something real. But the law and the county clerk, and eventually the circuit judge, all agreed that a technicality of paper outweighed 22 years of a woman's sweat. It was a lesson Odessa absorbed slowly and bitterly, that the world was often willing to call a person's worth invisible simply because it had never been written down in ink. The fall came not all at once, but in a series of small, deliberate cruelties that Odessa would later describe. When she spoke of it at all, as being erased one page at a time. First, Silas arrived with the sheriff and a folded document, informing her with a coldness that still startled her in memory that the ranch, the cattle, and the house were now legally his, and that she had 30 days to vacate. Odessa had pleaded her case before Judge Holloway in the county seat, laying out the ledger she had kept in her own hand for 2 decades, the receipts, the letters Thomas had written praising her management of their affairs. But Silas's lawyer argued, not unpersuasively, that affection was not ownership, and that a wife's labor, however devoted, created no claim recognized by Wyoming territory law. The judge, an old man tired of disputes among grieving families, ruled in Silas's favor with visible reluctance, and told Odessa privately, almost kindly, that he was sorry the law offered her no better shelter. She left the ranch in the last week of October, with the first frost already silvering the grass, carrying only what she could fit into a single trunk and a carpet bag. Her mother's quilt, a small tin box containing $41 in silver she had saved from egg money and mending work over the years without her husband's or Silas's knowledge, a Bible, and a few kitchen tools too worn and plain for Silas to bother claiming. The neighbors who might have taken her in were themselves stretched thin by a hard year, and the boarding house in Coldwater Bend charged more per week than she could sustain for more than a month. She was by any measure the world recognized destitute, a widow of 44 with no deed, no children, no husband's name to shelter behind, and a bank account so slim it could be counted in coins rather than dollars. And yet something in her, some stubborn inheritance from her father's workshop, refused to let despair settle into the final word. She began, in the weeks that followed, to walk the edges of Coldwater Bend with the same watchful eye she had once turned toward broken wheel rims and lame horses, looking for whatever the town itself had given up on. It was in early November, at the monthly tax auction held on the courthouse steps, that she first heard the name Cliffs spoken aloud, and heard it spoken with the particular scorn reserved for a joke everyone in town had shared for 30 years. The auctioneer, a portly man named Gideon Loomis, read the parcel description with visible amusement. 11 acres at the terminus of the old Prescott Trail, the wagon road that pioneers had once used to descend into the Sweetwater Valley before a shorter route had rendered it obsolete, land that ended, quite literally, at a sheer cliff face where the trail simply stopped as though the earth itself had refused to go any further. No one in Coldwater Bend had lived there in decades. Some called it cursed, recalling a rumor that a wagon party had frozen to death near that cliff in the terrible winter of 1849, though no one now, living, remembered the details with any certainty. Others simply called it worthless, since 11 acres of exposed rock and scrub with no water rights and no road access beyond the abandoned trail itself could support neither crops, nor cattle, nor a sensible person's ambitions. When the bidding opened at $10, no one raised a hand. Odessa, standing at the back of the small crowd with her tin box clutched inside her coat pocket, found herself thinking of her father's voice, of broken wheel rims and lame horses, and before she had entirely decided to speak, she heard her own voice offer $12. Loomis blinked, glanced around for a rival bidder, found none, and let the gavel fall at $14 after a half-hearted counterbid from a boy clearly egged on by his friends. The crowd laughed, not unkindly, but not gently either, and someone remarked that the widow Marsh had bought herself a fine view of nothing at all. Odessa said nothing in return. She only folded the receipt into her tin box, where it sat now, beside her remaining $27, and walked the 4 miles out to see what she had purchased. She reached Cliff's End on a gray afternoon with the wind coming hard off the western ridges, and stood for a long while simply looking at what her $14 had bought her. The old trail wound up through sage and broken shale before ending, abruptly and almost violently, at a rock face perhaps 60 feet high, streaked with lichen and scarred by decades of runoff. It was, she admitted to herself, exactly as useless as everyone had said, except that as she walked the base of that cliff, running her hand along the stone the way she had once run her hand along a cracked wool rim to judge whether it still had life in it, She noticed something the tax assessor and the auctioneer in 30 years of Coldwater Bend gossip had apparently never noticed at all. A section of the rock face, perhaps 8 feet wide, did not weather quite the way the stone around it did. The lichen grew differently there, in patches rather than sheets, and beneath a screen of dead brush she found, half buried in decades of blown soil, the unmistakable straight edge of hewn timber set into the rock itself. She spent the remainder of that afternoon clearing brush with her bare hands until her palms bled, and by the failing light of early dusk, she had uncovered enough to know, with a certainty that made her sit down hard on the cold ground, that she was looking at a door. Not a natural fissure, not a trick of shadow, but a door built by human hands directly into the face of the cliff, framed in timber gone gray and hard as iron with age, sealed shut with clay and packed stone that had held for what she guessed must be decades. There was no handle, no visible hinge, only a small carved mark near the top edge that she could not make out in the dimming light. She walked back to town that night in the dark, her hands raw and her mind racing, and told no one what she had found, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because she had learned, in the bitter months since Thomas's death, that discoveries shared too soon could be taken from a person just as easily as a ranch could be taken from a widow. It took her the better part of a week, working alone with a borrowed pry bar and a patience that surprised even herself, to open that door enough to slip through. But she finally did, on a cold, clear morning with frost still silvering the sage outside. She found herself in a chamber cut and shored with timber into the rock itself. Dry as old bone and untouched, it seemed, by the 60 or 70 years that had passed since anyone had last stood inside it. Her lantern light found first a row of iron-banded barrels, their staves still sound, containing what she would later determine to be seed grain, remarkably preserved by the cold, dry air. Beyond the barrels stood shelves of tools, harnesses gone brittle but recognizable, and a small strongbox, unlocked, containing not coin but paper, a bundle of letters, and a leather-bound ledger whose pages, though foxed and fragile, had survived the decades in that sealed, breathless dark far better than anything left in open air could have. She sat on an overturned crate in that hidden chamber and read by lantern light until her eyes burned, and what she learned there reshaped her understanding of everything the town believed about its own history. The ledger had belonged to a man named Ezra Whitlock, who, the pages revealed, had led the wagon party that founded what would become Coldwater Bend, and who had, in the terrible winter of 1849, guided a group of nearly 40 settlers down the Prescott Trail only to find their intended route blocked by an early, catastrophic snowfall. Rather than perish on the open trail, Whitlock had led his people to this cliff, where an earlier survey he had made showed a natural hollow in the rock, and there, over 3 desperate weeks, the party had shored up the hollow into a shelter, kept themselves alive on what stores they carried, and eventually descended safely into the valley once the weather broke. But the ledger recorded something more than survival. Before the party dispersed to stake their separate claims and found the town, Whitlock had proposed, and every family head had signed their name to agree, that a portion of their combined seed stock, tools, and a modest sum of pooled silver specie be left sealed in that shelter, as what he called, in his own careful hand, a common trust for the town's future, to be opened and used collectively whenever the settlement faced a hardship no single family could survive alone. It was, in essence, the very first act of the town's civic life, an agreement of mutual care written into a ledger and sealed behind a door meant to be reopened by whoever led the community through its next great trouble. But Whitlock had died the following autumn of a fever, and his son, who alone knew the location, had been killed 2 years later fording the Sweetwater in flood, and with him the memory of the door and its purpose had vanished from the town's living knowledge entirely, leaving behind only a faint rumor of a frozen wagon party and a trail that led nowhere. Odessa sat with that ledger in her lap for a long while, the cold silver specie she found beneath it. Nearly $600 in coin, a considerable sum for that place and time, resting forgotten beside her, because what struck her far more forcefully than the money was the plain, unmistakable intention written in Whitlock's own hand. This was never meant to belong to one person. It belonged, by the founder's own design, to whichever soul discovered it in the town's hour of need, to be used not for private gain, but for common restoration. She thought of her father's workshop, of things the world called ruined until someone bothered to look twice, and she understood, sitting alone in that lantern-lit chamber, that she had been given not merely a fortune, but a responsibility. Word travels quickly in a small town, and it was not many weeks before rumors began to circulate that the widow Marsh had found something out at Cliff's End worth more than the $14 she'd paid for it. Odessa had been careful, but not careful enough to escape the notice of Cornelius Pratt, the town sole banker, a precise and unsmiling man who held the mortgage on nearly half the farms and businesses in Coldwater Bend and who had, over 15 years, built his considerable comfort on the steady, grinding interest those debts produced. Pratt had heard enough from a hired man Odessa had briefly engaged to help clear the trail, from a careless word dropped at the mercantile, to suspect that Cliff's End held something of genuine value, and he moved with the swift, quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He arrived at Odessa's rented room above the mercantile on a Tuesday evening with a folder of papers and a manner that managed to be courteous and menacing in equal measure, informing her that county records showed an old, unresolved lien against the Cliff's End parcel dating back to an unpaid survey fee from 1851, a lien which, he claimed, his bank had purchased along with a bundle of other dormant county debts the previous year, entirely as a matter of routine business. He proposed, with the smooth reasonableness of a man who did not expect to be refused, that Odessa sign over whatever she had found in exchange for the bank's forgiveness of this lien and a modest cash sum besides, framing it as a generous mercy toward a woman who surely did not wish to become entangled in a costly legal dispute she could not hope to win. Odessa recognized the shape of the trap immediately, having watched Silas Marsh's lawyer perform much the same maneuver with a ranch deed only months before, and something in her that had been quiet and yielding through her husband's death and her banishment from the only home she'd known hardened now into a resolve she had not known she still possessed. She told Pratt, with a steadiness that surprised them both, that she would need to consult a lawyer of her own before signing anything at all, and she spent the following days doing exactly that, traveling to the county seat to consult not only a lawyer, but the original territorial land office records, where she discovered, with the same patient thoroughness her father had once brought to a cracked wheel rim, that no such lien had ever in fact been recorded against the parcel, and that Pratt's claim rested on nothing more than a forged or fabricated document. He had likely prepared the moment he suspected her discovery held value. Armed with this, and with the ledger itself, which established beyond any reasonable dispute both the parcel's true history and the founder's explicit intention that whatever lay within be used for the town's common good rather than private gain, Odessa returned to Coldwater Bend not as a supplicant, but as a woman who understood, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, that she held something the town needed far more than the town could ever take from her by force. She called a meeting at the schoolhouse on a Sunday afternoon in early December, inviting the whole town rather than negotiating quietly with Pratt alone, for she had learned that secrecy protected only the powerful, while openness protected everyone else. She stood before her neighbors, many of whom had laughed at her $14 purchase only weeks before, and read Ezra Whitlock's own words aloud from his ledger, telling the story of the frozen wagon party and the shelter carved into the rock, and the trust the founding families had sworn to leave for whoever came after them in hard times. She reminded them, gently but without flinching, that this had been a terrible year for Coldwater Bend, a poor harvest, a hard winter beginning early, and no small number of families. She knew from her own years keeping ledgers, sitting only weeks from losing their farms to the very bank whose owner now sat in the third row with his arms folded and his face carefully composed. And then she did something that silenced the room entirely. She announced that she intended to honor Ezra Whitlock's original intention exactly as he had written it, using the silver and the recovered stores not for herself, but to establish a common relief fund, administered by a committee of townspeople rather than by any single person or bank, to help families through the winter and to buy back, at fair value. Any mortgages Cornelius Pratt might otherwise be tempted to foreclose in the difficult months ahead. Pratt rose to object, calling the ledger a convenient fiction and questioning whether a woman with no deed to her own name and a widely known grievance against her own family could be trusted with such a claim. But his words landed poorly in a room full of people who had watched, over 15 years, how his interest rates tightened whenever a family's luck turned, and who had heard, in just the last hour, the sworn word of their own town's founder read aloud from a document whose age and authenticity no one present could seriously doubt. It was old Judge Halloway himself, present that day as a private citizen rather than in his official capacity, who spoke next, observing quietly that he had ruled against this same widow only months before on a matter of a ranch deed, a ruling the law required of him, but had never sat easily on his conscience, and that he for one intended to trust her judgment now, as he had been unable to honor her claim then. The room's mood shifted visibly, and within the hour a committee had been formed, with Odessa at its head not by her own request, but by the town's near-unanimous voice, and Cornelius Pratt left the schoolhouse that afternoon considerably diminished, his forged lien quietly abandoned rather than pressed, for he understood, as men of his particular caution always did, that a fraud exposed before an entire town was a debt no amount of interest could ever recover. The months that followed asked more of Odessa than the discovery itself ever had. She spent the deep winter organizing the relief fund with the same careful ledger-keeping instinct that had once managed a ranch's accounts, matching the recovered silver and grain against the town's most urgent needs. Buying back 3 mortgages from Pratt's bank at prices he had little choice but to accept once word spread of how his forged lien had nearly cost him his standing entirely, and seeing to it that seed grain preserved for 6 decades in that dry rock chamber found its way into the following spring's planting for families who would otherwise have had nothing to sow at all. She did not use a single coin of Whitlock's silver for herself, keeping instead to the small allowance the committee voted her for her labor administering the fund, a decision that earned her, slowly and without her seeking it, something she had not felt since Thomas's death, the quiet, settled respect of a community that had finally learned to see her clearly. Silas Marsh, watching from a distance as his sister-in-law rose from a discarded widow to the town's most trusted steward, found his own standing shrinking in proportion to hers, for neighbors who had once shrugged at his legal victory over the ranch deed now spoke of it, in the way small towns eventually correct their own record, as the shabby thing it had always been. And within 2 years he had sold the ranch and left the county altogether, unable to bear the quiet weight of a reputation he could no longer outrun. We began this story by telling you that at 44, Odessa Marsh had nothing left in the world but a tin box of coins and the clothes on her back, cast out by a man who believed a woman's decades of labor counted for less than a signature on a deed. We told you she spent $14 on a strip of land everyone called worthless, and that something sealed inside that rock would change not only her fortune but the fate of a forgotten town. What waited behind that door was never simply silver or grain, though both mattered greatly in a hard winter. What waited was a truth her own father had taught her in a wheelwright shop in Ohio decades before she ever set foot in Wyoming territory, that the world is forever quick to call something ruined, forgotten, or worthless, when in truth it has simply not yet found the person willing to look twice. Odessa Marsh had spent her whole life being the one who looked twice, at broken wheels, at lame horses, at a burned-out cabin, and finally, when the world had declared her own worth invisible, at a cliff face everyone else had walked past for 30 years without seeing anything but stone. If you have made it this far with us, thank you for spending this quiet hour in the company of Odessa Marsh and the forgotten trail that led, against every expectation, not to an ending, but to a beginning. Perhaps you know a place like Cliff's End in your own life. A person, a talent, an old forgotten thing that the world has already written off, but which you have always suspected, quietly, was worth more than anyone let on. We would love to hear about it in the comments, because we believe, as Odessa did, that value overlooked is not value lost, only value waiting to be found by someone patient enough to look twice. If this story moved you, We would be grateful if you would share it with someone who needs to hear tonight that it is never foolish to bet on something the world has given up on. Until next time, stay close.